Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with the wonderful Jon Lee Anderson. Jon is an author and staff writer for The New Yorker. He's been a long-time observer of political violence and revolutionary movements, and he's reported from many war zones all over the world over many years, which include, but are not limited to, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Angola, Somalia, Mali, Liberia, and he has frequently reported from Latin America and profiled political leaders such as Pinochet, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chávez, Nicolás Maduro, and he is also the author of a celebrated biography of Che Guevara. I've read it. It's a very good biography of Che Guevara in the English language. And he is the author of the latest book, To Lose a War, The Fall and Rise of the Taliban. That's what we talk about today. In this episode, we cover an overview of Afghanistan generally, its makeup, its terrain, its people groups. We talk about how the Taliban came to power the first time in the mid-90s. We talk about the makeup of the Taliban and how different folks are part of the group and how they interact with other groups. We talk about some of the intentions of the Taliban for having an Islamic state. We talk about Hamid Karzai, who was the president of Afghanistan right after the invasion. We talk about how the Taliban became resurgent in 2012. We talk about the withdrawal and why it was so, the U.S. withdrawal, that is, and why it was so disastrous. And then we talk about the Taliban 2.0, the Taliban that has been running Afghanistan for the past 4 years. And of course, we talk about what the future of Afghanistan might look like. This was a wonderful conversation. Jon is legendary for his reporting and his writing, and it was a big honor to get him on the podcast. Of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So get over to the Substack, subscribe, share with your friends. And now I bring you Jon Lee Anderson. I am here with the one and only Jon Lee Anderson. Jon, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Big honor, big honor.
Javier, great to be with you. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. You've written many books. Some people may know you, as I was mentioning, for your biography on Che Guevara, which is a great biography in the English language. There's obviously some that have been written in Spanish. And you got a new one out called, not a new biography, but a new book called To Lose a War, The Fall and Rise of the Taliban. That's a great subtitle. I really like that. Usually people see the rise and fall. It's the fall and rise. That's kind of what the story has been there. So we're going to talk all about it. Before we do, why don't you just give listeners a snapshot of kind of who you are professionally and what you're currently up to.
Sure. Thanks a lot for that. Yeah. So, I've written for The New Yorker, for the New Yorker magazine since 1998. Before that, I wrote books for the previous 10 years. They were journalistic books, mostly about war. I had wanted to be a naturalist, but ended up being this guy who went to, foreign battlefields, and that's what I got to learn about. Before that, I was I cut my teeth in Central America in the 80s as in the civil wars there, and then went all over the world. Wrote a book on guerrillas, as in the humankind, then Che, and then joined The New Yorker, tail end of the Clinton years. And since 9/11, I, found myself going to the places that we then went to war in. I alternate mostly between Latin America, which is sort of my first true love. I speak Spanish. It's my other place. And and that world, the world of the Middle East, also Africa, which I love. I live in England, but I'm American. I grew up overseas, son of a foreign service officer and a writer of children's books.
Oh, well, very nice.
Yeah.
So writing is in there somewhere for in
it's
the
in
family.
there somewhere. Yeah. My mother inculcated a love of books, wouldn't let us watch TV. I grew up in a lot of different countries. So
That's
I
nice.
sort of am one of these oddball Americans who am on the one hand, very much American on the one hand, and yet live most of my life outside of it on the other. So
I love it. I think Americans. I'm always pushing for Americans to be a bit more international in their thinking and how they do things. So that's great. Just a question. I've said this before in the podcast. My dad's from El Salvador, and he came to the U.S. in 1980 because of the Civil War there. Have you ever been to El Salvador? Were you there?
I lived in El
80s?
Salvador during the war.
Oh, wow.
In fact, I was conceived in El Salvador.
Where did you live in El Salvador?
I was conceived on the slopes of, ¿cómo se llama? El volcán in San Salvador, the Escalona.
Izalco.
Yeah. I was born in California, but only born there because my father quit his job. He was working as an advisor, an agricultural advisor, and he had been sent there thinking he was going to be helping the peasants, and ended up working for an oligarchy family, and couldn't stand it and quit. And that's why we left, and I was born in California. I returned. I returned in the 70s as a teenager, traveling through just as things were kicking off, and I returned again in from 82 to 90. I was there a lot, and I lived there for 2 years during the war.
Wow.
I was stringing for Time magazine.
Well, you'll know. I mean, firsthand experience. I mean, it was pretty horrific, all the things that happened there. So
it was an extremely violent place, and all of us who lived there and reported on it feel a special bond to the place. My friends from that period are Salvadorans, people I formed strong bonds with and still know. Some have had to leave recently. A few hang on in there. It's a lot of us really feel strongly about that country because it's never really had its day in the sun,
It's true. Yeah, a small country, but it hasn't had its day in the sun. And I had it's always weird. I mean, this, it's my family and stuff. So, all my tios and tias and, all that. So it's just so interesting hearing other folks talk about it. But I had a wonderful conversation with Jonathan Blitzer, who wrote that fabulous book earlier this year. It was a great book. So
a really good book.
That's very, very nice. He's
smart
lovely
guy too.
Yeah, he's lovely. So, okay. So Afghanistan, wow. I mean, where to begin, right? I mean, Afghanistan is such a fascinating place to me. I know some people see it kind of Middle Eastern, but really it is an Asian country.
It is.
It's an Asian. It's very much of that. Just tell me, just to kind of start us off here. I mean, you've been there for, throughout, post 9/11 so many times. You detail in the book. You have all these amazing experiences. I guess, at the start of when we were there and throughout and all these things, what's your general, when you think back on it, thoughts and feelings of covering the Taliban and many folks in Afghanistan over 20 plus years? I mean, what's it like? What's that experience like for you?
I like Afghanistan and the Afghans. They get under your skin. The country does too. It's an incredible place. It's a really wild landscape. It's got the Hindu Kush Mountains, deserts. It's rough. It's also like time travel. People live there in many parts of the hinterland as they've lived for thousands of years. They have incredibly strong sense of themselves. They're deeply rooted in their culture. They're people of the land by and large. They're poetic. They're larger than life. They're storytellers. And so it's one of those countries, there are a few amongst the many I've been to that stay with me, and I think stay with others too, because of those reasons. When the people are larger than life, however poor, however ravaged by war or whatever, the fact that the people are storytellers, have a strong sense of themselves, is something that helps form a bond. You respect them. I respect the Afghans. They are an ancient people.
Yeah,
of course, it's a polyglot. It's a landlocked nation. It's really Central Asia, as you said. It's been invaded by every empire known to man since 7000 BC, and you have these people that are resolute, hardworking, and dauntless. Dauntless. So I always feel a certain amount of nostalgia when I think about Afghanistan. Actually,
that's nice. Yeah. I was fortunate. I had a conversation, maybe it was last year or a year and a half ago, with Seema Samar, she's lovely, and
yes.
you can just see, when she talks and her story and stuff. Listeners can listen to the episode. It's great, but she's just an amazing woman, and
really?
you can just see all of the experiences and the hardship, but the crazy amount of resilience, and seeing all the kind of complexities. I could have listened to her for hours. It's I got a 1% of kind of what you're saying. There's definitely something there that's really special with Afghans.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
So, it's unfortunate, right? Because all of that, they have a long history, they have complex people groups, it's a different terrain, mountains, all these different things. But sadly, here, at least in the United States, people know Afghanistan as, the place that we went invaded after 9/11. Maybe some people remember the old Tora Bora campaign, all the other things, and most people know Afghanistan for the Taliban, which is, again, that's not all of Afghanistan. So it is unfortunate that it's only seen for one or two things. But so you can weave in and out some other things that people might not know. But you do cover the Taliban throughout the book. I guess 96 to 2001 was when they were first there, and then now they've returned. How did they come to power in Afghanistan? What was the kind of, set the table for us? How did that happen?
We have to go back a little bit. So 1970s, the monarchy had run Afghanistan for, a couple of hundred years. It was this state that continued to be invaded. The Brits tried to take it 3 times in their Raj era, failed. It became an independent nation in 1921. Both the Soviets, who occupy the northern border, and us as post-war, sniffing around the world and seeing what we could do, helped give it some infrastructure back in the 50s and 60s, irrigation channels, roads, that kind of thing. So there was a period, a kind of golden period of I would say, post-war years until about the 1970s when the king was overthrown by a cousin who had different ideas, and he was on the left, and it was the slippery slope to the Afghanistan being engulfed by warfare that we know today. He himself was then overthrown in a bloody coup by communists. There were rival communist factions in the country. In bloody back and forths, they tried to radicalize the country. They tried to bring the people of the hinterland, men in burqas, men with beards, into the modern age, sort of forcibly, setting off a backlash amongst the people in the hinterland, the rural people who were conservative, and also students who had begun to learn Islamic theory at universities. Some had gone abroad, and they formed a resistance network to the communists, who were then supported by the Soviets, who invaded the country in 1979. Over 10 years, the Soviets ran riot across Afghanistan. They installed a former police chief as the boss in the country, Afghan, and they brutalized the country. About 2 million Afghans were killed out of a population of less than 20. At least 5 million were forced into refugee camps in Iran and Pakistan. And the Americans, this was now the Reagan era, decided to try to weaken the Soviet Empire by helping these resistance groups against the Soviets. And we sent in Stinger missiles and through Pakistan, and the Saudis also helped. And sure enough, we weakened the Soviet effort in the country, and they had to leave. They called it a retreat, but it was a defeat in 1988, which is when I first went there, by the way. I went there and spent time with the Mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviets and their remnants at that time. It was a ravaged place, Afghanistan. So then the Mujahideen, that's what they called themselves, holy warriors, although they included everything from moderate Afghans to more conservative factions, proceeded to fight amongst themselves. There was about 7 different groups from all around the country for power. And eventually, after 3 years of the Soviet withdrawal, they descended upon the capital and ripped it apart. The capital had been largely preserved in all these years of war with the Soviets, and now it was just ripped apart. It looked like, many parts of it looked like Dresden after the bombing. It was that bad. Many tens of thousands of people were killed, and the group that emerged were a conservative, mainstream conservative, but not overly Islamist group that was an amalgamation and dealt with the Western world. The U.S., which had helped, kick out the Soviets, at this point sort of had checked out. We were busy throwing ourselves a party because the Soviet Union collapsed right after they exited Afghanistan. In fact, some people believe that it was the death knell to the Soviet Union, that their defeat in Afghanistan. But having said that, so there you had it. The 90s was this miasma in Afghanistan. By and large, we were looking elsewhere, and then 9/11 happened. So, but along the way, the Mujahideen, the holy warriors who were in power in Kabul and fighting amongst themselves, destroying everything, found themselves displaced in 1996 by a group calling themselves the Taliban, who swept out of Islamist cemeteries in Pakistan, first took the southern city of Kandahar, and then came north with a clarion call against what they saw as the corruption of the Mujahideen commanders, these warlords who'd taken the country and were ripping it apart, and in fact were corrupt and had committed all kinds of mayhem. So they were seen as this kind of astringent saviors. But when they arrived in Kabul, in the capital, the others cleared out, and they turned it into a kind of, before ISIS, there was the Taliban, 1996. Right. The first thing they did with the former president, whom they found on the UN compound, was castrate him while still alive, drag him around on a motorcycle, shoot him, and hang him from a traffic post. They instituted a harsh interpretation of Sharia law, in which women who were seen as adulterers or whatever were taken out to a soccer stadium and shot in the head or stoned to death. People were hung from lampposts. It was brutal. They, in their 6 years in power, they brutalized the country. They were very sectarian. They believed the Shiites, they're a Sunni group. The Shiites are apostates, and they massacred many. They, they chased out the intelligentsia. They were idolaters. They were iconoclasts. So they took against the Kabul Museum in this country that has its civilization that dates back to the 7th century BC. They took hammers to ancient objects in the Kabul Museum. They destroyed the Buddhas of Bamiyan. It was sickening what was happening. They were on a frenzy of Islamization in its most primitive form. Yeah, and disavowed and disobeyed and disregarded any attempt, any pleas for them to moderate what they were doing. And then came 9/11. As I said before, and lo and behold, our attention swerved back to Afghanistan immediately because, of course, Osama bin Laden was there. They'd given him sanctuary. He had plotted his attacks from there, and they refused to give him up. So we went to war with the Taliban.
Mm.
And we then, we would displace them from power. And he ran off into the hills, only to be found 10 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. began this long, 20-year-long expedition in the country, which was initially a police action and morphed into many other things before we finally left and handed it back to the Taliban.
Yeah,
that's in 2021.
We'll come to that because that's just an absolute crazy aspect to the story. Yeah. I guess who makes up the Taliban? I mean, they're made up from international places, right? From Uzbeks, Chechens, Pakistanis. Is there more people than just folks in Afghanistan, or is that not true?
No, the Taliban really are a Pashtun people. It's the majority people of the south of Afghanistan. Traditionally, they were the rulers of the monarchy and have always been an ascendancy in Afghanistan. There are many other peoples in Afghanistan, but roughly speaking, you have a kind of the circular country, and the bottom half of the circle is Pashtun. It bleeds into Pakistan, and the northern half is Tajik, Persian peoples. And they speak Dari, so they speak Pashto and Dari, and they come from different, they're different peoples, and within them there are clans and subgroups and other tribes, and it gets complicated. And over the years, over the centuries, they've made alliances. Some are more adversarial, and so on. So the Pashtun, when they arrived in Kabul, which was a mixed population. Kabul was really the only city in Afghanistan, so to speak. There are a couple of others, but which was cosmopolitan and where all of the sects mixed without real distinction. And so when they arrived back in 1996, they were a largely Pashtun chauvinist force, imposing their beliefs and their writ on other sects, which is why the previous government, which was an amalgamation of leaders from different sects, pretty much cleared out and had to clear out. It was very violent. And then fought a kind of losing battle in the north of the country until 9/11, where the former government basically ended up with about 5% of the territory at the time 9/11 happened. And it was that 5% where the West made strong and made alliances with the warlords in the former government, which included Tajiks, Uzbeks, and others, to fight against the Taliban. Now, there were, in 9/11, when we came into the country and were fighting the Taliban, like I say, it was predominantly Pashtun, but they had allies from Uzbekistan, former Soviet Union, from Chechnya, and from other radical Islamists from other places. These, in turn, had formed movements that had come to Afghanistan as the last best place to see their own dreams fulfilled. So there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Uzbeks in the country. There were hundreds, certainly, of Chechens and others, Pakistanis, thousands, helping to create the Taliban dream, this Islamist emirate that they had declared there in 1996. But they in turn have formed somehow their own Taliban. But the Taliban that are in power today are the remnants of that group. Taliban means student. They were seminary students who then became military men and have reinstated an emirate in the country, and according to a kind of rolling interpretation of very strict Sharia law. More severe than any other on earth, in fact, with the possible exception of ISIS when it was running Mosul and Raqqa.
I mean, about that, so you give us a few chapters and examples of people you had talked with, Mamur Hassan, and you talked with Rabbani, like some of these big characters. What was at the time, early 2001, 02, whatever it was, what was the idea of the Islamic State? How did they get these, ideas? I mean, you're saying they're kind of, seminary students, but this very strict adherence to Sharia law. Obviously, the thing that gets put in kind of international media is the, pretty, I mean, draconian is probably a nice word for it, ways of treating women and having them wear all of these, mandatory head coverings and the penalty for that and all these things. Not able to be educated, go to school, former school, all these things. And there are other things too about following that.
Sure.
And so I'll just say as a footnote here, 2 billion Muslims around the world, something like that. It's so many. There are many Islams, and most, the overwhelming majority, are pretty nominal, moderate, sometimes cosmopolitan Muslims. So obviously the Taliban or other extreme groups, don't represent all of Islam, of course. But what was their idea of the Islamic State and this strict adherence to Sharia law?
So to answer that, I have to, and I'll go back to Mamour Hassan, whom I got to know in 2001. He's a really interesting guy. In fact, just yesterday, I had an email from his son out of the blue after 20 years. There you go. His son, who speaks English, has email, this warlord in the north of Afghanistan that I spent time with, because I think he's an interesting figure. But to talk about where this interpretation of Sharia comes from, I have to go back to 1988, when I went to Kandahar and spent time with the Mujahideen, who were living in the desert outside that city, an old holy city with a big mosque and the traditional seat of their kings. And they, I lived with a guy called Mullah Nakib, who was a local Pashtun tribal chief who'd become eminent during the war. He held sway in a valley just north of the city. There was a hill in between. And he had about 30 Mujahideen warriors, boys in their 20s, who basically spent their days praying and firing recoilless rifle charges into the city. And we, in turn, were bombed by MiGs, still flown by Russians. And it was just a charnel land around there. I saw no women ever in my time in Afghanistan. They were all in Pakistani refugee camps. All of the villages were destroyed. But I made it into the city, the besieged city, within a few blocks of the besieged garrison, where there was another warlord who was more violent and hardline than my guy, but they were in alliance. And while I was there, word came that the imams of Kandahar, this is to say, the two men, that the Shura, the groups of the Mujahideen that had arrayed themselves around this besieged city and were controlling most of the territory, had given a kind of ecclesiastical power to. They were conservative men, devout, with relative degrees of devotion, but they were by and large rustics, countrymen, rural men who'd been at war with the communists, the atheists, for 10 years. And the two most respected men in the region were the imams, the holy men from the mosque. And the men agreed to come to an area in the war zone where they would be protected by the Mujahideen, and they would establish the law of the land according to their interpretation of the Quran. Now, this is in 1988, long before the Taliban were even heard of, so 6 years before. So while I was with Mullah Nakib one day, we heard that the imams, who were in a place under heavy guard, but in the middle of the war zone, maybe 2 hours away by pickup, had banned music. You might remember that this became known, the Taliban became known for this. They also banned child's play, right? But so my Mullah Nakib was curious about this, and he said he wanted to find out more. So he sent a group of men, his top guys and a handful of guards and myself, to go meet with the imams and find out what this edict was. Because in the camp, that's, besides praying and shooting recoilless rifles into the city, they listened to music all the time. These kids loved music. They were, like I say, 20-somethings. A lot of them were just teenagers. And the Afghans loved music, and they would sing. They recited poetry. They're very romantic. Their music was all about waterfalls and love and unrequited love. And they're really kind of they're very tweeny in their tastes of music. They were anyway. So we go to see the imams. There's a couple of irascible old graybeards guarded by even more irascible mujahideen from another faction. I was looked at like some kind of Martian, but I was respected because I was with Mullah Naqib's men. They informed us that they had banned music because they realized that the mujahideen boys were being distracted by this, and this was temptation and therefore sinful. And they needed to pray and keep their minds focused on the war. And so, yes, they had agreed to ban music. So we drove back to Mullah Naqib's camp. We informed him of what we'd heard. And in front of me, he told his men, okay, look, guys, just don't play your music loud. So there was this kind of easygoing, okay, those old men, they're pretty severe, but I'm going to let you play music. Just don't make a big deal out of it. Keep it low. We were in a war zone anyway. There was nobody around us, so whatever. That was, like I say, 6 years before the Taliban. Now, why is that important? Because it turns out that Mullah Omar, who later emerged as this kind of prophet-like figure and this enigmatic seer who became he was never, one photograph of him exists, but he became the leader of the Taliban movement. This kind of enigmatic religious figure was possibly there that day. He emerged out of that court, that open air courtroom of the Mujahideen in those years. In the years that followed, in all of the mayhem of Afghanistan and the civil war of the Mujahideen that took over, he emerged as the leader of this force that were ascetic students. It was male. It was like a bunch of men who'd been cooped up for a long time and spent most of their time praying. And so some of their first actions were against licentious commanders who were seen as pederasts, whom they killed, and who were causing scandals amongst the local people for their excessive and decadent behavior. And their first actions of assassination against some of the commanders around Kandahar, not Mullah Naqib, but others, were applauded by the local people. And then they took over. And once they made strong in this heartland of the Pashtuns, by and large, the people, after all of these years of war, were happy to go along with this kind of astringent force. And they declared themselves to be this kind of purging force against decadence, keeping in mind now that this is 10 years of communist presence in the country where women were allowed to hold their faces open, therefore of loose morals, as seen from the countryside and the rest of it. And they swept to the north. And because the Mujahideen, who had fought against the communists and seized power in Kabul, the capital, and then destroyed it, had lost any real constituency or credibility, they were able to encircle the city and take it.
Is the general view, I guess, at the time, maybe 95, 96, and then maybe even throughout the more recently, that the Taliban are kind of like maybe this isn't right, but they're sort of revolutionaries of sorts. They're fighting against the Western Empire and the Soviet Empire and all. Is it that the kind of? I mean, again, not everywhere, but is that a kind of way of people viewing it? Freedom fighters, that kind of thing.
Yes, that's an interpretation. Some would argue against that because they would say that, well, those of us who were moderate, who were not Islamist, who were secular nationalists, who came before them, and not only in Afghanistan, but say throughout the Middle East, where you saw the post-colonial, eventually dictatorships and revolutions, whether it was Nasser or Assad or Saddam, these were the anti-colonial, Gaddafi, these were the anti-colonial revolutionaries. Now, the Afghan were something different. In a way, it was kind of an out-of-time thing, perhaps because Afghan was such a cut-off place. and so isolated. And its history had been sort of delayed, by the Soviet invasion. It was never truly colonized. It was occupied. It was brutalized, but it was never truly colonized. So you had this. It's Fort Apache. It's West Virginia. It's it's Wales. It's that place in the hills that nobody ever could fully subdue.
Yeah.
And the Soviets didn't manage it either. So the Taliban come out of this tradition of resistance, where for a man, true manhood is to show his bravery and courage in battle. And this is a society, except for the tiny group of people that were the upper class and middle class, tiny, by and large, this is a land without any material comforts. I've met Afghan men and women in their 40s, 50s, 60s who've never sat on a cushion in their life. These are people who are, it's body against the earth. They live tough lives. Most Afghans, by the way, look 10, if not 20 years older than they are. Invariably, you ask a man how old he was. Mostly they don't know.
Right.
Not because they're necessarily ignorant, but because they don't celebrate birthdays. But if they do know, sort of, they'll say, I think 47. They'll look 65.
Wow.
And it's the same with the women when you can see their face. Anyway, point being, for the people in the countryside who had been brutalized by war, who'd been terrified by the radical kind of expeditions of the communists and the Soviets, and prior to that, a history of being ordered around and modernized by force by one of the kings of Afghanistan back in the early to mid 20th century, which also received a lot of pushback, by the way. Most of them went along with the Taliban. Now, it has to be said also, by the way, when you're in a place like Afghanistan, it's a bit like if you've read Machiavelli's, The Prince. When you read some of those passages about how those warlords back in the 1500s, 1400s, operated and changed sides, it's less about loyalty to a cause than it is about obeisance to whoever has the guns. So if they're your people, they speak your language, and they claim to have a direct connection to God, and you're an illiterate peasant who happens to be Pashtun and has always had someone as your overseer, you're going to go with them because they have got the guns, and you don't want them to mess with your wife, your daughters, and you don't want them to kill you or your son or your sons.
Just something that's coming to mind, we're talking about kind of revolutionaries or freedom fighters, things like that. I mean, I'm not trying to do comparative analysis here per se, but I mean, you've spent time in Latin America and written about folks there. How do you see it as similar or different if we're looking at things? I mean, obviously, completely different people groups and different histories and all that. But generally, how do you see it as in your experiences?
I would say that the difference between sort of the Islamist revolutionaries, if we're calling them that for the sake of this argument, right?
Sure.
And so many of them would say that they're revolutionaries. And I think more so if you move from the Taliban into the Al-Qaeda radical Islamists who, formed alliances with them, or for that matter, have come to the fore in places like Syria and elsewhere.
Yeah.
These are people who definitely see themselves as revolutionaries, who come out of countries where failed quote-unquote revolutionary experiments in socialism or proto-fascism over the past 50, 60 years have failed, and they have emerged as the power. Why do they see themselves as revolutionary? Because they have an ideal in mind. They are shaking up society. They're revolutionizing it in order to create this vision that they have. Now, what's the difference between the revolutionaries of the Middle East, I would say, or Islamist revolutionaries, and those of, say, Latin America or the West? The revolutionaries of Islam believe in a kind of notional paradise that existed in the 7th century. The Caliphate, they talk about the Caliphate, the one that, built the Alhambra in Granada and and ran Spain for 800 years. They have this, and that conceived of astronomy and all these things, this kind of latter day moment when the Muslim world achieved some kind of greatness. It exists for them. It's sort of the Muslim MAGA, as in, Trump talks about, right? I don't know which United States was in Trump's mind was great exactly. I suppose it was, I don't know, when white people owned slaves, and I don't know, what I mean? And Manifest Destiny and conquering the Indians. But maybe that was great America, but we're not really sure. But for many Muslims, particularly those who believe in this idea of caliphate, whether it's Taliban or Al Qaeda or ISIS or their equivalents, they think of this, this shining moment before their dreams were usurped by the infidels, the apostates, the materialistic Westerners, the decadent Westerners, the Christians, those dogs of Christ, and so therefore it's a reactionary force, in my view. Some could argue this, and I'm not a theologian, but I would argue, and I have argued with Islamist friends over the years about this. And in the end, they seek a kind of return to a glossy, simple past where all doubts are removed. And how do you remove doubts? Because you impose Sharia, and people must obey because it's the word of God. There's no interpretation. They have a direct connection to God. Of course, for me, the fallacy there is that you have to rely on men, usually, to interpret the will of God. And therefore, this idea that they're somehow anointed, certain men with flesh and blood are anointed by God, and you have to take them at their word as they slice off your head or whatever it is, or stone your daughter, that they know what they're doing. So I would argue that is more reactionary than revolutionary, but in its practice and in its rhetoric, it is revolutionary. In the West, in the secular West, that is to say, in what we know of as the secular West, let's say since the French Revolution, until, say, Fidel Castro's revolution. Revolution is this other thing. It is not a backward-looking movement. It looks forward to this idea of a better tomorrow. It's equally utopian and maybe equally illusory, but it looks to the future rather than the past. Yeah.
That's a very nice distinction. I really, really do like that. I do get this sense or this vibe that there's a call to having another Islamic civilization, which, probably up until modernity is gone. But there was, especially in the region, Islamic civilizations. And you see that when you go to certain cities. If you go to Istanbul, if you go to Damascus, you see the remnants of when there was an Islamic civilization. And you go to any of these mosques and it's like, you're in awe. It's just like, well, I mean, this is absolutely astounding. And you can see the traces of that. I always get a feel that it's a kind of you're saying, a backwards look into that time of when we were really great or things like that. That's my kind of, outside read on it. So it's very interesting.
Yeah.
What about, a big figure here. So, so 2001, 9/11 happens. We get into Afghanistan. We start, having our misadventures there. Hamid Karzai, really fascinating person. So there was an interim government in the early days, and then he had a long tenure. I think he had 2 long terms or something like that. I don't remember what it was. Yeah. How did he work to try and rebuild the country, working obviously with the U.S. there, trying to rebuild post-Taliban rule? What was his kind of makeup? Was he a puppet of the U.S. and was just kind of being used by the U.S., or did he have his own ways of doing things? Like over the 14 years, whatever he was in office, why was he the one that was there, and how he was selected and then, elected, and how did he work?
Sure. Well, okay, first of all, so you have to understand we've talked a bit about the history, the fact that the Pashtuns were the kind of preeminent people in the country, and that they were the traditional royal family, right? The Papulzai clan within the Pashtun people were the traditional royals. So he is a relative he's a royal relative.
Oh,
now, in the anti-Soviet 80s, he was he became known to Westerners as a kind of decent guy who was the spokesman for one of the factions, not a particularly severe faction, a moderate faction of mildly conservative, and he came from a good family, and people got to know him, including journalists. I never did, but he was known, and he was connected to the royal family, which, as I say, was displaced first in a coups, then during the Russian attempts to turn the country into a Marxist state, and then finally by the Civil War. So actually, after we come in 9/11 and this police action following 9/11 to chase the Taliban out of power and pursue the Al Qaeda, we need allies. So we come in where the Northern Alliance, made up mostly of Tajiks, that is to say, Persian-speaking people in the north, but not only, some warlords in the north, also Uzbeks and others. We kind of rent-a-mob them along with B-52s, and we chase the Taliban from their places of where they've been entrenched. But we're also looking for a political figurehead that will help lead the country in this amalgamation of a country that is such a mess. And the first man that was thought of as the possible leader of this new Afghanistan was a man called Abdul Haq, whom I did know. He was a Mujahideen leader from the 1980s. He had lost a leg. He was from an important clan in the east, Jalalabad, that city, on the Pakistan border. He was quite a charismatic and guy. I liked him. I remember him talking to him in 1989. I found notes from him from our conversation 12 years later, in which he said, "Forget everything else. The people we have to worry about," this is 1989, "are these Arabs," and he's talking about bin Laden's people, that had now come into the country and allied with some of the Mujahideen, and not only to oust the communists, but to essentially Arabize and turn the country into this base for radical Islam, which they did. Anyway, he was chosen and dropped into the field by the CIA, and Al Qaeda pursued him and hanged him. He had a violent end before the war was over, and so they found Karzai. They I forget who suggested him, but Karzai became the alternative, and he was also dropped into the country by air. So yes, formally speaking, he was a puppet. Taliban disappear. You have Hamid Karzai. He looks good. He wore that wonderful robe everybody loved. He was kind of the Zelensky of his day until it turned sour. He spoke well. He spoke several languages. He came from the right family, the right group of people. He did outreach to the other people. He is a mild man. I believe him. I'm not being sardonic here. I think he was a well-intentioned man. I believe he still is. He's living in Kabul, by the way, somehow in a gilded cage in Taliban-held Kabul. And however, he was weak. He was perceived as a puppet. And as our stay there intensified and sort of transmogrified, and the war intensified too, as the Taliban began fighting back, and our military presence grew and expanded and became a NATO mission as well, Karzai became increasingly tetchy at odds with the Americans who were there, because he was increasingly seen as a puppet by his people. He would have to scold us when we bombed a wedding party, which we did on numerous occasions, or our soldiers kicked down doors or humiliated men in front of their families, which was a cultural no-no and helped trigger a lot of resistance in different areas of the country, making the counterinsurgency effort more difficult. He tried to do that privately many times, he told me. And when he could no longer, now past Bush, it was during the Obama years, he began to let off steam in public, which created an increasingly sour atmosphere between the Americans and him. But you're talking about a man who we put in power. He did what he could to gain that space. He was reelected. And yet he never truly became the president of all the Afghans. And I would say, and this is one of my strong criticisms of what we did there, it's because we did not invest him with enough sovereign power. We never let him be truly the president of his own country. He made many promises he couldn't fulfill because he depended on us for the material lift and effort to fulfill those promises. And so he began to be seen as a straw man, as a hollow person. And that was really unfortunate. I think our stay in Afghanistan could have been much shorter if we had seen our project there as primarily what it was in the beginning, a police effort. Then having chased the Taliban rather, and Al-Qaeda off into the hills, created a strong state that, yes, would have to be jockeying with the various clans and so on. But by and large, working under our jurisdiction, but then build up an army that could fight the Taliban before they had regained strength. And it was about 3 years we were distracted by Iraq. And we could have left that country. We could have had a big embassy there. We could have had whatever you want. Mm-hmm. But by and large, the Afghans could have gotten on with their lives, and we could have gotten on with ours.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing there.
It's unfortunate.
It is. I mean, as much as I love my country, when you hear our excursions around the world, we do seem to be the villain. A lot of the times it's not great, you know. And again, that's not to say that it's all terrible. I mean, but no. You know, I mean, I think going to Iraq was, I mean, probably one of the worst things we did, maybe even more than Vietnam. But you know, who knows? Well, I'll let the historians figure that out. But yeah, that's the thing that's interesting. As we really pivot to Iraq, you know, as you mentioned in the book, with much speed that's gained, Afghanistan becomes sort of on the back burner, and we're two different places. Obviously, we've sent a lot of people over there, unfortunately. So as early as 2012, so it's interesting. You tell me how much you know of this or what you think of it. You know, there was obviously the kind of conservative Bush doctrine, the kind of more hawkish kind of way of doing things, you know, and the brain trust there with, you know, Rumsfeld and Bolton and whoever else, everyone that was there. But there was a shift with Obama. However, you know, it does feel like foreign policy doesn't really change. There's U.S. foreign policy and you have administrations, but more or less it's not dramatically different, even with Trump, to be honest. You know, but Obama had, you know, again, nobody's in the Situation Room. No one's with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so whatever. But the point is the same. It seems like U.S. foreign policy stays pretty constant. How did it in 2012, you know, the U.S. military just wasn't as welcome anymore. And there seemed to be a big shift here. This is sort of going into second term of Obama. How did the Taliban start to regain a presence and control as the Americans weren't as focused on Afghanistan anymore? Yeah.
I mean, it's a really good question. So you're right. So we have, you know, Bush leaves office it's the beginning of 2009, isn't it? As I recall. Obama is a neophyte in foreign policy, as you know, he won office. Bush left under a cloud because we were now entangled in two quagmires, Iraq and Afghanistan, and this was widely seen. Iraq was now known to be a complete disaster. Yeah. The tension, you know, it was in the midst of a horrific sectarian civil war by then. You had Obama coming in wanting to figure out how to possibly get out of Bush's wars, right?
I mean, he campaigned on that. He won the Nobel Prize. He, you know, all the things, right? That's all the things.
That's right. And so we saw him largely make that effort in his 2 terms in office. And, you know, he could be faulted. I would say not for malintention, but for look, all presidents have to do this. We've had different kinds of bad decisions and good decisions made by our various leaders. And, just going back to Iraq for a minute, was it right for Obama because he saw Iraq as such a disaster? There was Bush's, and therefore, but he now had to deal with. Was he wrong to draw down our troops there and then declare some kind of victory and retreat when he did? Only for us to see ISIS surge out of nowhere and almost take over the country and then bloody the world as we could never have imagined just a couple of years later. Or in Afghanistan, was he right to go along with the kind of hawks who were saying, look, we haven't put in enough effort, let's put in a surge of troops, 33,000 more troops. This was John McCain's argument and those of others who were military men who were saying, okay, look, we screwed up, we shouldn't have gone to Iraq, but we need to end this thing. And the only way to do that, because the Taliban are resurging, is to show them that, we can kick their ass, because that's what they understand.
But the thing is, we did this in Vietnam, and we knew as early as 1965, 1967 for sure, we were way over our head. We weren't going to win. McNamara knew that. He knew that in 67. He didn't tell Johnson. Johnson then figures it out, and he keeps going until 73. I mean, it's just insane.
I hear you. But you know what? In both Iraq and Afghanistan, there were still some Vietnam-era guys who'd been there as young men. And I think they, as they say in Spanish, they had to sacar los clavos, to pull the nails out. Of that feeling that they hadn't been able to show their real mettle in Vietnam. And so we began to see in both countries, I'm not kidding you, I encountered young soldiers, officers and others who began to talk to me about, by the way, so we're doing hearts and minds, and proceeded to tell me what that was, as if I had no knowledge of that phrase. Never. That I had, no kidding. And they clearly didn't know that it had been tried and tested and failed in Vietnam. General David Petraeus, who then became our CIA director and for a while was the head of the multinational force in Afghanistan, became a kind of heroic, lionized figure for going around talking about drinking tea with the imams. And as if this was the solution, that nobody, a savant-like kind of vision he'd had, that this was actually the secret to really good counterinsurgency. And by sitting down and having tea with these people who's going to show them that, we dignify them with our presence and they will respond in kind. Well, I'm sorry, 9 years into a war, you're not going to win them over by drinking tea with them.
No.
They will say whatever you want them to say in that tent. And when you leave the tent, they will stab you in the back, because that's what they do.
But this is the other thing about this. Like, I understand that people have there's a modern era and things like that. But as you said at the beginning, this is a country. This is these are people groups that have been there for thousands of years. That's in the histories and the annals of their histories. They've been over this. They have this there. Like the arrogance of, we're going to drink some tea and we're going to just, cut it with them. And it's like, maybe that might work somewhere else. There's no way that's going to work in a very ancient place like that. That's such an arrogance.
By 2000, yeah, exactly. By 2010, I was there, and 11, I made 2 trips there. There in the book, there's some encounters. I made one where I'm sitting with a colonel with let's put it this way, a civilian analyst, a young woman from the United States. I'm not sure which agency she was with.
Sure.
And a kind of warlord character whom he suspected of being the guy who was attacking their road workers on a road that the Americans wanted to build for counterinsurgency purposes, right? So they told me beforehand, we're going to have tea with this guy, but we think he is behind it. So in front of me, they basically offer him a job. So in other words, it was a whole exercise in co-option. It was a bit carrot and stick. They kind of threatened him too. And they thought, okay, well, maybe if we do that, he won't attack us anymore. and we'll be able to get the job done. But this is the kind of quicksand type social situation that the American colonels, well-intended American officers being told, okay, you've got Maiwan province, do what you can to clean it up. And you had all these NATO countries switching provinces. Like I was in Maiwan the year before, it had been in the hands of the Canadians. They handed it off to the Americans. These guys, brave, courageous,
Sure.
lieutenant colonels, sergeants, captains with young men
Sure.
whose lives they wanted to protect,
Of course.
being put into a completely hostile alien environment without any real knowledge of the terrain, the history, and much less the language. My criticism at the highest level is this business of how we treated Karzai, this idea of not creating a truly sovereign power in the country, which we should have done. The second was never really engaging with the country. We didn't even require our officers to learn the language, for Christ's sake. I actually, in 2011, was talking with a nice young captain from, I forget where he was from, New Jersey, Connecticut, whatever. And I was talking to him about that. I said, is it true that we still don't require language skills? He says, actually, no, we've just begun. I mean, I was told, I forget whether he came out of Leavenworth or West, I don't think it was West Point. He said, we're supposed to learn 60 words. I said, did you? He says, maybe half. So, that was our attitude towards the local culture
So did people, when we did that, people started just saying, maybe we just get the Taliban back in here. I mean, how did they did they just take advantage of some of these holes?
They were a shadow government 10 years before we left the country. Yep. In many of the places I was in, the American commanders would point out Afghan officers to me that they were having to deal with, that they suspected of being their counterpart, the shadow government. They knew that was operating. So, look, if a bunch of, I've used this analogy a couple of times. It might offend some people, but actually, let me switch it, because maybe that'll offend less people. But if a bunch of, say, American, university-educated Americans came from the Upper West Side, let's say, went to rural Texas and took over and started telling all those yahoos what to do, and starting infrastructure projects and paying people here and there, do you think that those yahoos aren't going to be talking to each other on the sly, making whatever money they can out of it, doing whatever the hell they want, and saying, don't worry, just keep your guns buried, guys. When these Yankees leave, we'll get rid of them. That's kind of what happened there in Afghanistan. And by the same token, when the Taliban came to Kabul, it was a bit like, Appalachia descended on the city. Because those wily, rustic guys who lived up in the hills, many of them had never been in a city before. I found Taliban wandering around Kabul in 2021, in the periphery of Kabul, which is dirt, basically, and just looking agog at it. Wow. And young guys in their early 20s is saying, look at this city. It's so splendid. They'd never seen anything like it. So you can imagine where they come from.
Yeah.
And, that, and then go back to our enterprise in the country. We had huge military power, huge, and they knew it. They're not going to stand and flip the bird at a warthog, which can shoot, or 450 bullets a second, or whatever it is, a minute, or.
Yeah, we had tanks and planes and troops and bases. I mean, we sent everything in there in the beginning.
They knew how to dodge and weave that. And meanwhile, they were just doing their own thing. They knew we weren't there for the long haul. I think we stayed surprisingly longer than they expected, but they knew that, we were going to leave. And by hell, I blame it on Trump really, because he started the dialogue with the Taliban and told them he wanted to leave, which meant they knew it was theirs long before Biden came along. But actually, Obama made it clear, going back in the day, that we wanted out, that it was a kind of uncomfortable fit for us. And there was a drawdown, but there was real blunders that having to do with our own political system. And I think each president's reaction to the prior administration, Obama didn't want to get entangled in the war on terror morass that Bush had created. Trump wanted to undo everything that Obama did. So he had his own pathology, right? And I think that probably counted for more than any notional desires as a peacemaker that he has, except for the fact that he wants a Nobel because Obama got one. That's all. But nothing else really matters. And here we are today.
Yeah, tell us really quick. By 2021, the Taliban had regained a lot of control of the country and things like that. And so, yeah, Obama had I think he had a couple thousands of troops, a peacekeeping effort, blah blah blah, when he left in 16 or early 17. And Trump didn't do a whole lot in his first term per se, but right when he was leaving, it seems like there was some things set in place, and Trump started it. I mean, basically, they made a deal with the Taliban of basically giving it over. This is a story I've been told, and then Biden really couldn't. He was kind of handcuffed. He couldn't. If he comes out of the deal, there was going to be an increase of resistance, and you got to send people there, and it was going to be a mess. And then, but if you stay with the deal, then you're basically handing it over to them, who we just fought for 20 years. So he was that's the story. I don't know if that's totally the case.
Roughly speaking, that's the truth. He told the Taliban, Trump told the Taliban that he wanted to draw down, and in return for you behaving this way, we'll leave. Well, they didn't behave that way. They came in, and they came in when Biden was in office. So Biden, I believe, was overly cavalier. I think Trump was frankly just stupid. I think you don't go to a poker game and show your ace card. That's what he did.
Yeah.
So as an insurgent force, all they had to do was wait. Yeah. Well, it began to fall to them. And so what happened? The Afghan force that we had backed up, by the way, they were doing all the fighting. We weren't even losing men at that point. We had a few thousand men. They began drawing them down to the point where the Afghans who were dependent on us for intelligence, airlift capability, all the rest of it, logistics, began to feel exposed and vulnerable. And so they began to fall apart. And as would happen in any country, some of them began to do deals with their Taliban counterparts, knowing, because after all, they're speaking in their own languages, in their own locales. They know that the future is not going to be an American backed up one. So some of them start to betray their posts, and the cities begin to fall. And once that happened, it was over. It was inevitable, And the Americans were still on the ground. Now, if the Americans had left a hard core of, say, 10,000 men, not in combat roles, but as to vouchsafe the counterinsurgency effort that had been made until that point, to make good on the investment in lives and money that the United States had expended there over 20 years, to make a point with this group that we regarded as a terrorist group, that we're not going to let you win, we're not going to let you come back. I think that they could have prevailed. I think the Afghan army would have held, and they would have prevailed. Yes, there was corruption, but by the way, there was corruption under our noses. And there was also corruption on the American side, although it tends not to be called that, because we were giving contractors vast sums of money. If we actually did an accounting of the, whatever it was, $2 trillion that were expended in the 20 years in Afghanistan, I would bet, this is a wild bet, but I would bet that 3/4 of it, if not more, went to our own companies or contractors, not Afghanistan. We didn't build anything in that country. Our bases were storm wire, mobile homes, and gravel. Even the gravel we imported. The water that was drunk by our soldiers, millions upon millions upon millions of dollars worth of plastic bottles, was imported from some guy in Dubai with whom we did a deal back in 2001. We never built the Afghans a water processing plant. I could go on.
Yeah,
it's
sure.
Outrageous what we didn't do for that country. And despite all of the noble and brave efforts of countless, not just Americans, Germans, Poles.
Yeah. It was a coalition. It was the whole coalition. In the beginning. Yeah, in the beginning.
It's really a pity. And so I believe that, going back to Biden, I believe he was cavalier. I think we knew that he had a habit of not really thinking deeply about some stuff and being very knee-jerk in his reactions to places. And apparently, for some time, this was unbeknownst to me before, that he really wanted out of Afghanistan and opposed the surge back in the day. And he just carried that with him. And I believe there was no real discussions. And he just said, "No, we're going to do it. We're going to leave."
But that's
and
super obvious because of how the withdrawal was. Look, if you already had this in place, okay, you didn't do it. Your predecessor did it. Fine, but like, organize it better. Organize it withdrawal better. I mean,
it was shameful.
It was shameful. Seeing people hang off the big plane. I mean,
it was shameful. I think any American watching that felt ashamed.
It was horrific. Yeah. And like, sure, it's not his fault, the whole process, but you can do it gracefully. I mean, everyone talks about leaving Saigon, in 73 or 5 or whatever it was, and it was terrible, helicopters leaving out of there. And it was just like, all right, see you later. We just, 8 years or whatever it was.
This was worse.
This was worse. This was way worse. And that's crazy to think about.
Yeah. In both cases, we betrayed the people that we had given hope to and made fight alongside of us. And I think that's the terrible thing. It sends a message that the United States is not serious. It's not a reliable partner. And it doesn't learn from its mistakes.
No, I honestly agree with that as well. Having, traveled a bit more internationally over the past 10 years and talking to people in different places and that, and then reading a bunch of history about it, again, I love my country and there's many great things about the US, but we don't learn. I mean, the fact that Vietnam was 30 years at the time we entered Afghanistan. And then by the time it's 50 years, we make the same mistakes, if not worse. And then along with Iraq. And it's just like, it's so frustrating. It is so frustrating.
Yeah.
And you can talk to military servicemen and women that have very negative feelings. They're proud to serve their country, but the way in which things were done, how these things worked, they were very unhappy. And the shame of it all is, what a disservice to Afghan people, who have had again, since end of World War I, a lot of hardship of many sorts with different entities. It's just, it's very frustrating. It's very, very frustrating.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Look, not to end on a kind of sour note, I agree wholeheartedly. And so, that's why I couch my criticism. I temper it with, acknowledgement of the courage and so on. And the fact that sometimes leaders make decisions not because they're malintentioned, but because they get the wrong, they just make the wrong decision. You can't know. Neville Chamberlain cut his deal with Hitler thinking that he was going to create peace in our time. It sounds kind of reminiscent, actually, of certain behavior at the moment. And unfortunately, he had to fall on his sword, and historically speaking, because Hitler betrayed that trust that he had thought he had built up and humiliated him. And we saw World War II. Was Neville Chamberlain an evil man? No. He was a well-intended man who made the wrong decision based upon, who knows, his own makeup, his own behavior. If you're going to play rugby, you better learn how to bash heads. If you're going to go to war, by God, do it right, because it's the worst thing man can do. Yeah, it's the worst thing any of us can do.
If you're going to do it,
because it means you kill people.
Of course, so, and you have to have an exit plan. You have to be willing. You have to plan it as best you can. Have some kinds of ways of understanding all of the aspects, the beginning, a middle, and end, as best you can, and then you retool it. I mean, the people I've talked to and things I've read have said we didn't have an exit plan, at least not clearly stated. Like in both situations, that's absurd.
No, we didn't.
That's absurd. That's
crazy.
We
didn't. It was the gang that couldn't shoot straight, frankly, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a knock-on effect of Iraq, really. And that's just So unfortunate.
Well, and so unfortunately, yeah, your book does have a sort of sober ending because, I mean, the Taliban come in a weekend. Everyone left the country, which was wild to me. I really couldn't believe that. I couldn't believe that. And then the Taliban come in, and I mean, how are things there now? I mean, we like I said, we obviously see how women are treated in Afghanistan, which is, I mean, horrific. And strict adherence. Let me ask just this as kind of a bookend here. You talked about in the 96, 2001, when the Taliban was there and they did all of these things. Some people have said it's worse now than it was when they were there in the 90s. How is it now there in Afghanistan?
So they're stricter with women than they were then in terms of what they're allowing them to do, in a sense. I think, in a sense, because I think the global expectations of a greater role for women has increased in these past 25 years, since they were there before. And therefore, it hurts more to see women who've been given, freedom to have that completely taken away. The last decree of the Imam in Kandahar was that they are not allowed to speak in public. Women's voices cannot be heard. We're past the head coverings and all that. Okay, whatever. People discuss that. But then I saw that not being educated, and I was like, oh my goodness, like that's wild. Not being educated, not allowed to work. Not allowed to travel outside of their home without a male relative, and not allowed to speak in public. So there's this kind of inexplicable misogyny that's been instituted there that is deeply troubling and upsetting, right? Yeah. Now, have women been taken out in public and stoned to death and shot as they were sometimes to jeering crowds during Taliban 1.0? No. By and large, I mean, things have happened, but not to that degree. At least in the city, the more moderate faction of Taliban are there and seem to have been told to kind of get along with people. This Taliban doesn't destroy the graven image. They all have smartphones now. They live in they pretend they don't know what you're talking about when you mention the Buddhas of Bamiyan and what they did before. In some ways, they're part of the Taliban are less radical. The new generation of Taliban, it's funny, some of them dress in the traditional Pashtun, shalwar kameez, tunic and pantaloons. Others affect the wardrobe of American Special Forces, which they thought looked really cool. And of course they have all the gear because we left it behind. So they left everything. So they direct traffic looking like SOF guys. Wow. So it's a weird hybrid. What can I say? And I think it will continue to evolve. Let's see. At the moment, it's cut off from the outside world. Only one country's given it diplomatic recognition. That was Putin's Russia last month. The Chinese have been signing deals for minerals. It's sitting on apparently $3 trillion worth of mineral wealth. It doesn't have anything, but it's got that. Let's see. Maybe next year, this month, Witkoff or some other emissary of Trump will go there to do a rare earth deal in return for humanitarian aid. We've cut off our humanitarian aid. Half the country depends on humanitarian aid to survive. It's a mess, but Afghans are resourceful, and that was the note I wanted to end on. So, please. Yeah. Yes, we've screwed up big time, but I think a lot of Americans and others that were there carried, like I do, fond memories of Afghans and and an awareness of their resourcefulness. And I have no doubt these are indomitable people. They will carry on. This is not a failed society. It's a society that has just been thrown another curveball, one of many. And they're resourceful, they're intelligent, they're courageous. They will survive. But and maybe in a few years more time, we'll figure out how to kind of digest the kind of tragic misstep that was the American misadventure there.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think all the Afghans I've met have been resilient people, very resourceful, with a rich history and just a lot of strength. So I agree. Jon, this has been so much fun. You're an absolute delight, and you're doing great work. And I know you're you're going to be going other places as well. So be safe out there, and you're welcome
Thanks.
back here anytime. So big thanks.
Thanks, Javier. Real pleasure.